All right, good morning and good evening. I'm Roger Baker, Stratfor Senior Vice President for Strategic Analysis at RANE. I would like to welcome you to Reshaping U.S. ROK Relations, a webinar co-hosted by RANE and the East Asia Institute and sponsored by the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Houston. In May of this year, South Korean President Moon Jae-in met with U.S. President Joe Biden, resulting in a joint statement that laid out a broad array of cooperation and coordination between these two longtime allies. I think today's discussion is very timely given the events on the Korean Peninsula in the last few days. And even this morning, I woke up to see the latest short-range ballistic missile test by North Korea and the successful submarine-launched ballistic missile test by South Korea. So things are certainly happening around that area. Today's webinar brings together scholars from South Korea and the United States to explore their expanding international partnership. And this part is moving beyond the realm of just traditional security into a broader set of issues, including semiconductor supply chains, alternative energy, and space exploration. These shifts must be looked at not just in a bilateral context, but in a global context. And as we'll hear from the speakers today, when we talk about a global context, that must take into consideration China. Our four panelists today will focus on both traditional security and these expanding areas of cooperation between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We're pleased to have with us today Sung-Ho Shin from the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University, Eric Gomez, the Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, Sung-Ju Lee, Chair of the Trade, Technology, and Transformation Research Center at the East Asia Institute, and Matthew Bay, a Stratfor Senior Analyst at RANE. We will have a question and answer time after the presentations, and you may enter your questions at any time into the chat. Before we begin, I would like to recognize Ambassador An Myung-soo, the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Houston, for the consulate's interest in these topics and sponsorship of this discussion. Ambassador An, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. Good morning or evening to everyone. I'd like to thank Mr. Baker and his team at Stratfor for taking care of the logistics for today's event. And I would also like to thank Dr. Son-yul and all the other participants from Korea. It is wonderful that today's digital platform can bring together great minds from different time zones. So I am truly looking forward to today's discussion on many topics of common interest to both Korea and the United States. The recent US withdrawal from Afghanistan interestingly brought a spotlight on the Korea-US alliance. The alliance has evolved over the last 7 decades, Korea becoming a key partner for the United States. When the alliance was forged in 1953, it was an alliance between unequals. Korea was unilateral recipient of US military aid and relied substantially on US troops stationed in Korea for defending itself against North Korea. Since then, Korea has developed politically, economically, and militarily as well. According to Economist Intelligence Unit Democratic Index 2020, Korea ranked among the 23 countries categorized as a full democracy. In 2020, Korea ranked among the world's top 10 in terms of total GDP in nominal terms. It is a leader in many industries such as electronics, semiconductors, automobiles, shipbuilding, steel production, and many others. Its conventional military strength ranked 6th in the world according to 2021 Global Firepower Index and 10th for military expenditure. Korea also has a great cultural soft power fueled by what is known as the Korean Wave, which encompasses music, movies, dramas, as well as online games and cuisine. Last year, Korea impressed the world for its successful handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Korean government proved that it was capable of effectively handling emergency situations such as a pandemic in a democratic way without taking draconian measures. The government did this by putting public health and safety first, taking swift measures on the basis of science. Above all, these measures were taken with emphasis on transparency. This year, Korea-US Summit, the meeting was held on May 21st in Washington, D.C., as Dr. Baker mentioned it. It was a truly successful meeting where the two leaders pledged a wide range of joint measures with the goal of restoring the alliance in response to current and emerging threats and global challenges. The summit reaffirmed the country's common security interests and signaled their commitment to facilitate future-oriented expanded cooperation beyond matters concerning the Korean Peninsula. First, the two leaders affirmed their commitment to an ironclad alliance as the linchpin for stability and prosperity of the Korean Peninsula and the Indo-Pacific region. They also renewed their shared commitment to denuclearization and permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, reviving the momentum for talks with North Korea. The two leaders also agreed to forge a comprehensive partnership to shape a better future together in various areas. They agreed to deepen economic cooperation, in particular to increase supply chain resilience in priority areas of semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries. Moreover, a global vaccine partnership was established to combine U.S. vaccine technology with Korea's production capacity to address the global pandemic. The summit meeting embodies the positive evolution of the Korea-US relations. The joint statement reflected Korea's status as the global leader in many areas beyond the Korean Peninsula. It was also recognition that Korea-US alliance has become more of an equal, comprehensive partnership. Recently, IAEA report revealed that North Korea appears to restart its Yongbyon nuclear reactor. This fact gives us a concern because North Korea proclaimed in January further development of its nuclear arsenal. It is imperative that the process towards denuclearization and permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula must be revived. Based on the Inter-Korean Agreement at Panmunjom on April 27, 2018, and Pyongyang Declaration on September 19, 2018. I'm sure these topics will be explored more in depth today, and I look forward to your thoughts and ideas on how the Korea-US relations can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador An. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Yul Sun, President of the East Asia Institute and the co-host of today's webinar. Dr. Sun?
Thank you, unmute. Thank you, Mr. Baker. I'm Yul Sun. I would like to thank Ambassador An and Consulate for sponsoring this timely event and bridging us to Stratfor-EAI for co-hosting it. I'd like to start briefly by introducing the East Asia Institute. Based in Seoul, Korea, EAI is an independent think tank dedicated to developing ideas and formulating policy recommendations on the main international challenges facing Asia and the Pacific. As a leading foreign think tank in Korea, EAI has been involved in research pertaining to U.S. ROK alliance and diplomacy, and I deeply recognize the importance of discussing this issue, especially at the high time of the U.S.-China strategic competition. In that regard, the summit meeting that Ambassador An just mentioned, and particularly joint statement, is a milestone. The bilateral coordination and cooperation between the two expanded and expanding from traditional security to cyber, space, climate, energy, health security, and also in terms of the range, expanded from Korean Peninsula to the Indo-Pacific. And our another issue today, economic, Also, the cooperation, bilateral cooperation, expands from conventional merchandise trade to technology and supply chain resilience, including semiconductors and batteries. I think here, Texas matters, as Samsung and LG, among others, are committed to a big investment, as I know, in Texas. So I hope that our exchange today serve as an important stepping stone in expanding our scholarly discourse on Korea-U.S. alliance and partnership, and broadening the horizons of cooperation between the two. Once again, I like to thank Consulate and Stratfor-EAI for the opportunity to participate tonight. Now over to you, Mr. Baker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And let me briefly introduce Stratfor and RANE. Stratfor is a geopolitical intelligence and analysis firm, and it's part of RANE, a network-based risk intelligence company that connects business leaders to critical risk insights and expertise, enabling risk and security professionals to more effectively address their most pressing challenges and drive better risk management outcomes. And I would agree with both the ambassador and Dr. Son. This is an important moment in the evolution of U.S.-Korean relations. And I'm looking forward to hearing the discussions and the ideas that are brought forth by our panelists today. And just as a reminder, you may enter questions at any time and we will address them at the end. To begin today's discussion, we're going to look at some of these traditional security dynamics in light of the changes in North Korea and in light of South Korea's development in defense technology, the US pullout in Afghanistan, and the US-China strategic competition. And we'll begin today with Dr. Shin.
Thank you for kind introduction. Let me briefly talk some traditional security issues that both Biden administration and the Moon Jae-in government, are discussing these days. One general outline is, as Consul General An laid out, yes, indeed, the May summit between the two leaders was very successful. And simply speaking, for me, it was the joint statement that came out after the summit with about 2,600 wording. That is, I think, I guess, one of the most comprehensive joint statement that ever produced between, in the process of this bilateral summit between US and South Korea in recent history. That just shows growing scope and depth of the bilateral partnership between the two countries, in which obviously the alliance management comes the first major issue, as Biden administration pledged to restore its leadership, regional and global leadership as an alliance partner in the world. And obviously South Korea and US, even though under the Mr. Trump administration, where the relatively managed partnership quite well, but there has been some issues such as SMA, military burden sharing issue. But the first thing, these two governments was able to agree on those key issues. Not only that, as pointed out, the United States showed its willingness of trusteeship on South Korea by lifting the so-called missile guideline. So that South Korea now can develop, without any kind of major limit in terms of range and the weight of its missile capability, which will be a very critical in South Korea's capability to meet the challenge coming out of North Korea's WMD capability, and along with also this another strategic weapon system such as SLBM, which was tested in front of President Moon Jae-in today in South Korea local time. So that made South Korea as a kind of seventh country in the world, which has that SLBM capability. By the way, it was a quite interesting tit for tat what it was yesterday, North Korea also fired like a quite long-range cruise missile capability. So it was a quite interesting dynamics between the two. But getting into the second issue of managing North Korea, how to proceed with this nuclear talks with North Korea. Obviously, these two leaders also still had quite a good discussion and agreement on basic principle and approach. I guess Mr. Biden obviously will have a different approach from Mr. Trump, but still, bottom line is they're focusing on diplomacy, and based on the what they call the calibrated and pragmatic approach by the Biden administration, the two countries will still continue with the effort of engaging North Korea to solve the nuclear issue diplomatically, which was shown in this Mr. Sung Kim, the special envoy to North Korean issue, who was designated by President Biden, but who used to be also playing the same role under the Mr. Trump administration. So that just shows continuing U.S. emphasis on diplomacy, and which I think is very well accepted by the South Korean government at the moment. The problem is how the North Korea will answer to this olive branch, by these two governments. And so far, there has been no kind of positive signal coming out of Pyongyang. Instead, it seems like Kim Jong-un showed up in this latest military parade in much better shape, at least in terms of his physical outfit. But he didn't say any major word regarding this returning to the negotiation table. Instead, he was more focusing on domestic issue and rallying the crowd, or more of self-help. So we have to wait and see. The third issue that the two government was dealing with was a kind of China, how to deal with this challenge of China in broader regional sense. And in that regard, also the two government is kind of closing in and in their approach to deal with those issues. That in the last summit joint statement, for the first time from South Korean perspective, they mentioned in very general terms supporting the peace and stability in the South China Sea, but also Taiwan Strait. That was a kind of first time the South Korean government jointly mentioned those Taiwan issue. Although there's still the level and the way in which they discussed it was much moderate than say in the case of U.S., Japan, and other case, but still South Korean government saying that their new southern policy is in a general sense there's a general alignment with the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, which is emphasize rule-based order and free and open Indo-Pacific order. So in that regard, also these two governments had much closer ties in dealing with those regional issues. Finally, on the global issues as well, I guess this was a really interesting time that, especially in the case of Afghan withdrawal, the South Korean government dispatched 3 military aircraft and eventually successfully airlifting 390 Afghan refugees, what South Korean government called special contributor to the Korean mission in Afghan reconstruction effort. That was unprecedented, I guess, in South Korean government. I mean, basically, these are the Afghan refugees, and we never accepted those level numbers of refugees from any other country before. So this shows us a kind of growing capacity or will by South Korean government to take up more kind of ambitious global or regional role when it comes to promotion of general universal values such as human rights and saving those kind of refugee in global era. So these all in all, this shows there are very general good cooperation and going on between the two governments. And this is my final point is that the Biden administration is the new government relatively, and Moon Jae-in we are having a kind of election, our own election coming up in next March. So still, whether what kind of government is in, anyway, the spirit of cooperation and bilateral alliance still goes, comes very strong. And that's a kind of very good sign for the future of two countries' alliance partnership. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Sheen. Let me turn it over to Eric Gomez.
Thanks a lot, Roger, for having me and for the consulate and EAI for also being involved in this. I'm going to talk about three sort of main issues in the U.S.-South Korea alliance, two of which are sort of directly related to security, and one of which is a kind of glue that holds it all together. And you'll see what I mean by them. So if I could have the next slide, please, Lamore. Okay. The first issue I want to cover is nuclear diplomacy with North Korea, which has been rather quiet recently since the failure of the Hanoi summit. There's been this sort of stalemate where I think the US and South Korea are eager to sort of make progress, but North Korea isn't reciprocating. And I think part of the problem with this is that even though the Biden administration is trying to find this middle way between what the Trump administration did and what the Obama administration did, there's no real reason for North Korea to engage, right? I mean, they're kind of in a good spot. I think that the US has significantly overestimated the amount of leverage we have over North Korea. And I don't think that progress via diplomacy is going to be possible unless the United States changes its approach. So I think the burden is on us, not necessarily on the North Koreans, because I think we are somewhat more insulated from failure here. And when I say a change in approach, I basically mean diplomacy and how the US structures its diplomatic ask of North Korea and what it's willing to do tactically. Because military options are far too dangerous to resolve the North Korea issue at this point. And also, as long as we sort of stay in the current diplomatic set of demands or approaches that the Biden administration has done, Kim Jong-un can afford to just keep testing weapons and sort of not, as long as he doesn't precipitate a new 2017 level crisis, he can just wait out the United States. The North Koreans kind of have everything they need to just sit tight and just wait to see if the US budges. So what do I mean by these potential changes in the US diplomatic approach? I think this is something that more and more American analysts are coming around to, but this idea of denuclearization was always a difficult objective, and now it's kind of become an impossible one. And I know that the South Korean government and the Japanese government as well really, really wants to keep denuclearization as a long-term goal, but it's pretty clear that if we adhere to that and nothing else, we're not going to get anywhere. There's just too much mistrust. There's too much of a North Korean nuclear program that exists to realistically expect it to completely rid ourselves of it. And so I think thinking about this problem through a lens of arms control, which acknowledges that this program is going to keep existing at least for the foreseeable future. However, there might be ways to prevent further development or to restrict its size. That would be better. And I have some examples of like what specific measures could look like, mostly from other scholars that have looked at this issue in greater detail. I can get into that in the Q&A, but since time is short, I'm going to just keep moving along for now. Another thing that, and I think the Biden administration is doing a good job with this, is prioritizing greater alignment with the South Korean government about how to do engagement with North Korea. When the Trump administration was in power, there was a big divergence between the ROK and the United States, and that led to a lot of problems with getting a sort of unified message or getting diplomatic progress going. And I think that alignment is important. The Biden administration is starting to work on that alignment, and it's going to be, so I hope it continues in that regard. And especially if the progressives win the blue house again, this is going to be important. And finally, I think the US side, Washington in general has a problem with accepting trading away things. I think that we saw this at the Hanoi summit where, the deal on the table, at least as reported, was that we would be trading away certain sanctions for a dismantlement of some or all of the Yongbyon complex, and the US side didn't think it was enough. And now Yongbyon reactor has restarted this summer after being dormant since, I believe, early 2018, or I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but since like sometime in 2018. That was a huge failure of the United States. And I think that this idea of denuclearization or bust sort of poisoned the US thinking in that regard, where it was like, we need more because we don't trust the North Koreans enough. The North Koreans say, we're not going to give you more because we don't trust you enough. And we think that you want to disarm us and we don't want to be disarmed. And then it fell apart. And so we lost sort of potential progress, even if it was small, because we were trying to focus on too big the thing. So I think this is something that the US needs to change. I don't know if Biden can change it because I think it's a deeper problem with, call it the US psyche, call it whatever you want. I think we just have a problem figuring out how we actually take this leverage that we built for ourselves and use it to get things we want. We'd rather sort of keep it in place, even if it's not improving the situation. Next slide, please. The second big issue to talk about here is how the US is going to structure its military posture in the region to deal with China, which is becoming the big primary threat that is motivating US military posture and strategy in Asia. One question that I've been looking at closely, because the Cato Institute is a restraint think tank, so we like the grand strategy of restraint, is does the Biden administration continue with the Trump administration's focus on this concept of overmatch that was in the earlier national defense and national security strategies, or does he recognize that the United States position against China is such that trying to sustain indefinite conventional advantage doesn't really work when you have a very dynamic economy on the other hand, and you're also trying to project power across the Pacific Ocean with the help of allies, but still that's a very difficult task. And does this prompt a deeper change in US strategy or strategic thinking? And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's hard to kind of read where the Biden administration is going. He's talked a good game about thinking creatively about the defense budget, but then again, Congress is kind of in the NDAA cycle this year is sort of pushing back and saying, no, we want you to spend more, and we're not going to let you retire some of the old stuff you want to, so you can make room for new capabilities. So this is going to be an interesting big question that motivates US force posture decisions. And I think in all this, in terms of the ROK role specifically, I don't know what the ROK alliance role is in competition with China. And I don't know if the US knows that, and I don't know if South Korea knows that. In general, there's a lot of discussion in Washington of, well, we have to keep the alliance and troops in South Korea as a check against China, but there's no real follow-up about, well, what does that mean? Does that mean US forces Korea are going to be engaging in military operations against China in the event of a conflict? Does the South Korean government let us do that? If they are expected to engage in those military operations, and that's where the deterrent value comes from, then does the 20,000 or 25,000 troop presence cut it? Because I think that's okay for dealing with the North Koreans, probably not for China, especially given the proximity of South Korea to China's Northern Theater Command. So you either have to expand that presence significantly, which I don't think South Korea would want us to do, or the US would really want to do. And so you can see, I could go on about this for a long time. I think the details are fuzzy here. I think the cooperation and the deterrent value or deterrent benefit is talked about in very general terms, and it's difficult to understand what particularly this looks like. And I think that's just because the South Korea-China relationship is not as intensely antagonistic as, say, the South Korea-North Korea relationship or the Japan-China relationship, where there's a sort of more obvious picture. Could we get the last slide? And it's, to tie this all together, I'm interested in tracking, domestic politics in South Korea, because I think Washington has a very strange view of this issue. We meaning, folks in DC, both policymakers and experts alike, need to do a better job of understanding where the Republic of Korea's domestic politics are and how it impacts the alliance. And I say this because when I've been to a lot of events recently, not this one, I've been to a lot of events recently about South Korea and alliance issues, and most of the discussion is from folks on the South Korean side who are coming from like a very particular sort of political or policy perspective, tend to be very conservative, tend to, and the US participants also tend to favor conservative ROK governments because they're generally seen as better for the alliance than liberals are. But the conservatives seem to be on the out and don't seem to have a super great chance of regaining the Blue House at this moment. Granted, I know a lot can change in 170 odd days. But I think that, these tropes of the liberal or progressive side of the ROK spectrum not being good for the alliance or conciliatory to North Korea or not a strong US friend are totally out of line with reality of what we've seen in the Moon administration. Even Lee Jae-myung, which is sort of being presented in the US press as a kind of South Korean Bernie Sanders, when you listen to him talk about how he's going to structure the relationship with the US and the relationship with North Korea, yeah, he wants to do diplomatic engagement. He's a progressive South Korean politician. Of course, he's going to want to do diplomatic engagement, but he's not this, I think the idea that he'll just let the North Koreans do whatever they want is wrong. And I think this is like something that colors US perceptions that needs to change. And then I think on US-China competition, where I see this domestic political thing coming in is that oftentimes the US, what I see anyway in Washington, is this perception that South Korean actions are not sufficient, that they're not doing enough, that they could be doing more. And I think the problem here is that the folks in DC tend to view the ROK as like Japan, right? And Japan is, I think, always going to be willing to move more in lockstep with the United States or do more aggressive things against China than South Korea will. It's not necessarily a sign that US and South Korean interests as it relates to China are diverging, but I think it's a difference in tactics and approach. And where the ROK has a lot of value add or comparative advantage is, as Dr. Sheen talked about in his presentation, in the summit with Moon, there was all this discussion of these things not in the military domain too, right? There was a bit of that security discussion, but there was all this discussion of the supply chain issues and climate change issues. And I think this is where South Korea could really shine in helping the United States figure out how to engage the region beyond just military alliances, because the US has been really terrible at that. Evan Feinbaum calls us the Hessians of Asia, and I think he's right, because to many Asian countries, when they see the United States, they see like a military partner first, but all of the other stuff we've kind of let atrophy over the years. And I don't think that's the makings of a long-term successful strategy for the US and Asia. And this is where I think the US needs to appreciate where South Korea is on the position, not try to force them to be something they're not, and figure out ways of saying, how can we, especially on these non-military issues, how can the US deepen its relationship with South Korea, or how could South Korea help the US in finding these non-military ways to engage the region? Because I think that would be really beneficial. And I'm way over my 10 minutes and I apologize, but we'll get on to the next presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. Thank you, Dr. Sheen. And that's a good transition, Eric, to get us looking at some of the non-traditional security dynamics and the expanding relationship. Just a reminder to feel free to type your questions into the chat. We've got some already in queue, but we will get to those after these next two presentations. And so let me hand it over to Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. First of all, I'm very much pleased to join this webinar to share my thoughts and ideas with my colleagues, both at EAI and Stratfor-EAI, and other participants here. I think I'm sure this is going to be a valuable as well as timely venue to examine the current status of the Korea-US cooperation and to find a way to upgrade or elevate the bilateral cooperation to the next level, particularly in the broad context of the US-China strategic competition. In that regard, I would like to lay out some pending issues, mainly from the perspective of international political economy, as well as emerging security issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. First issue I would like to pay attention to is that the emergence of economic security linkage. As is well known, the US and China closely linked economy and security in engaging the strategic competition between the two countries, and the economic security linkage has very quickly spread into other parts of the world. Given that kind of changes, the spread of economic security linkage, which is triggered by the US-China strategic competition, I think it's time to shift the focus of our discussion from whether one to how the economy and security are linked each other. I think to this end, it is worth noting that the technology, particularly high-tech, functions as a nexus linking the economy and security. It is firmly believed that immediately after taking office, the Biden administration embarked on the 100-day supply chain review. And the final report claimed that commercial foundations are central to the US national security. I think this statement vividly shows the Biden administration's perception of linkage between economy and security. So in accordance with this kind of perception, I think the US government specifically designated the following issue areas to address. The first, the defense industry's reliance on limited domestic suppliers. Second, the global supply chain vulnerable to disruption. And third, competitor country suppliers. The reason why I pick up this issue is that the technology is one of the key and promising areas of cooperation between South Korea and the United States. I think it is against this backdrop that the interest in economic statecraft has dramatically increased for the last several years. In the process of strategic competition between the US and China, many countries try to diversify the means of economic statecraft. In reality, I think the US and China mobilize various means such as industrial policy, subsidies, and protectionist measures to secure an edge in strategic competition. At the same time, they also integrate bilateral, regional, and multilateral forums of negotiations. Next slide, please. Thank you. Second point I would like to make is that the US attempt to link economy and security is also demonstrated in the US push for restructuring of the supply chain. And in this regard, the COVID-19 turned out to be a decisive moment to reveal the vulnerability of supply chains. In fact, the COVID-19 spread around the world, and the bottlenecks in some countries within the supply chain disrupted the entire supply chain. So the fact that China plays a core and central role in the global supply chain, ranging from daily necessities to medical products and personal protective equipment, was recognized as a security threat to the United States. In other words, I think the concerns have increased within the United States over the possibility that China may take advantage of the vulnerability of the supply chain as a strategic asset in dealing with the United States. Next slide, please. I think this is why the governments of Trump and Biden administration push for the restructuring of the supply chain. In order to promote supply chain restructuring, the Biden administration pursues a balance between reshoring and international cooperation. The Biden administration seeks reshoring to reduce the vulnerability of the supply chain by expanding domestic production capacities within the US while creating quality jobs in the US economy. At the same time, it is pretty obvious that relying solely on reshoring has limitations in strengthening the resilience of supply chain. That's one of the reasons why Biden administration seeks international cooperation to diversify the supply chains. Next slide, please. I have highlighted how the US and China interacted each other to shape the contour of the US-China strategic competition. I also emphasize that the economic security linkage and economic statecraft has become widespread. From now on, I would like to lay out some strategic considerations that Korea may take into account to effectively respond to the challenges arising from the US-China strategic competition. First, I think it is undeniable that the uncertainties in the international order has dramatically increased, which is not good for South Korea. I think in that regard, Korea needs to closely monitor the direction of changes in the bilateral relations, and the United States and China seek strategic competition. I think the US and China display a dual dynamics of competition and limited cooperation until they find a new equilibrium in their bilateral relations. Partial decoupling, competitive recoupling, and managed interdependence are just few examples of those new equilibrium you can think of. I think Korea needs to closely monitor and review the advantages and disadvantages of each alternative model of equilibrium. Second point is that it is necessary to prepare for the spread of economic security linkage. It's not only the US and China that closely link the economy and security. Moreover, economic security linkage is highly contagious into other countries. So under the circumstances, Korea needs to establish a domestic institutional arrangement so that it can respond quickly and flexibly to the spread of economic security linkage. Third, I also would like to highlight that the US-China strategic competition produces a systemic impact on the global order as well. So we cannot rule out the possibility that the world order is split between two blocks as reflected in the numerous discussions about the splinternet. So that's one of the reasons why Korea needs to promote cooperation with other countries that share concerns about this possibility to promote middle power diplomacy. Last slide, please. Wrapping up, I would like to make some suggestions about how to enhance cooperation between Korea and the United States. First, in the short to medium term, I think the Korea needs to create a kind of virtuous cycle between cooperation in reshoring and friendshoring promoted by the Biden administration and Korea's supply chain restructuring. Korea also needs to approach the bilateral cooperation with the United States in terms of diversification of supply chains, as well as strengthening resilience. Also, the Korean government needs to make efforts to upgrade the bilateral cooperation with the United States. In other words, Korea should strive to transform the bilateral cooperation with the United States from a production alliance into creating an ecosystem of cooperation for technological innovation. Second, Korea and the United States should broaden the bilateral cooperation to constantly find new areas of cooperation. In the recent Moon-Biden summit, in addition to Korea's commitment to massive investment in semiconductors and batteries, both governments agreed to cooperate to enter the global nuclear power generation market. Both countries are in particular expected to focus on small modular reactors which is the most advanced form of nuclear power generation. I think this is a good case in point where both countries could elevate bilateral cooperation into the higher level. Lastly, I would like to stress that it is necessary for both countries to put the bilateral cooperation in the broad context of regional and multilateral cooperation, particularly given that Korea is one of the few countries in the region with technological capacity, U.S. needs, as well as the Moon Jae-in government ambitiously launched and promoted new Southern policy within the broad framework of regional cooperation. Let me stop there, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And let me hand it over to Matthew Bay.
Thank you, Roger. And of course, thank you to the Consulate, EAI, and RANE for putting on this event. So I'll be brief and quick. I know that we have all kind of spent a lot of time already talking about these issues. But I wanted to start off by saying, and Limor, you can go to the first slide. I wanted to start off by saying that we are seeing in many places, or in the United States, that the Biden administration and the Trump administration were very much aligned on this idea that in many ways, economic security, industrial security is national security. Of course, we saw the Trump administration launch a review of imports of cars, imports of steel, under the idea of, well, does this hurt national security? Historically, those have been reserved for things like energy security and other issues. Of course, the Biden administration really didn't agree with those moves, hasn't agreed with them. But we are still seeing the Biden administration really shift to the idea that, you know, industrial security matters, but really focusing on what I would view as, you know, new strategic sectors, whether it be semiconductors, whether it be 5G, communications, telecommunications, cyber issues, cloud computing is another emerging one, artificial intelligence, et cetera. All of these new areas, which are really the foundations of the modern economy. You can make the comparison to oil in the sense that, you know, data is the new oil. All of these things are either processing data, or collecting data and stuff like that. So we are seeing the Biden administration take some approaches that the Trump administration took around trying to really protect the US's access to information, in some ways restrict China to have the same kind of access to emerging technologies to build their own systems. And of course, South Korea, as one of the most innovative economies and one of the most countries with some of the most innovative companies in the world, especially in telecommunications, 5G, smartphones, et cetera, is a natural partner for the US within that. The other big shift that we have seen the Trump or the Biden administration do compared to the Trump administration is that the Biden administration has been much more concerned about essentially blowback of its policies. The Trump administration was more or less trying to go at it alone when it came to really stripping down China's access to Western technology and US technology. Not really being as concerned about, well, what happens then to, say, for example, TSMC's business relationships with Huawei when the US put Huawei on its export control list. Instead, the Biden administration is actually looking more to partner more closely with countries like South Korea in order to really try to make sure that the externalities or the consequences of US policy aren't as disruptive, essentially. There's a little bit more of a concern there. And of course, obviously wanting South Korea to put into place similar restrictions on China's access to these high-end technologies. So with that kind of, you know, as the backdrop, I think that the semiconductor and the high technology industry, which is what the slide is really showing, is probably the most important area of this kind of strategic competition between the two of them when it comes to high technology. I don't need to tell anybody on this panel that, you know, South Korea is one of the most important countries when it comes to manufacturing, especially memory chips, but also increasingly logic chips, et cetera, down the road. Of course, Samsung doing massive investments here in the United States as the US is trying to rebuild its own domestic capacity for manufacturing. But as we move forward, as China does try to, you know, increase its own domestic capabilities, I think the US is going to take more steps to try to restrict that access, and also try to take more steps to ensure that South Korea is lockstep within that strategy, whether it means banning, for example, the exports of high-end chips to Huawei, or technology or equipment, or, you know, substrates, et cetera, to SMIC, the other Chinese main manufacturing semiconductor company. That's going to be an open question as to how far the US is going to be willing to actually be successfully in putting into that policy. The other big area is what I would say is similar to the Trump administration's clean network policy, which was essentially trying to reduce China's access to or ability to use any network technologies to gain access to Western communications, Western data, U.S. data, and U.S. allies' data, et cetera. The Biden administration was willing to be as aggressive in enforcing that same kind of policy, but the Biden administration is not really taken any steps back to really try to not be as strong against Chinese apps, not be as strong against Huawei, et cetera. The Biden administration is really maintaining that in many ways, and I do think that's a critical part where moving forward, you're going to be seeing things more important as China becomes increasingly, I guess, like, for lack of a better word, encroaching on Western information, other Asian country information, et cetera. I mean, one of the side effects of kind of the U.S. technology strategy against China is that they are cutting off China's access to gain Western technology through legitimate means, imports, export control deals, things like that. What does that make China do? It makes China, one, double down on investment into state-led investment into their companies, but two, it also gives them a higher incentive to engage in cyber espionage and industrial espionage to gain access to that technology through what the U.S. and South Korea would view as illicit means. So that means that cybersecurity cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea is going to become more important as we start to see China become more aggressive in its ways that it tries to really seize and access technology. And then Lee Moore, if you go to the last slide. And then, of course, alternative energy and climate change. That's a big area that I know that, of course, we've seen South Korea come out making a much stronger commitments around net zero by 2050, cutting emissions by 2030, et cetera. Of course, the Biden administration is very different than the Trump administration when it comes to environmental policy and climate change. And given that China has a stranglehold over electric vehicle battery manufacturing, South Korea is the main other player within that. So of course, that's a natural area for cooperation between the two that does have a lot of opportunities down the road, especially if the United States does try to put into place similar constraints over on Chinese imports of Chinese batteries or Chinese components go into batteries because of its own supply chain reviews, concerns about what China's role within that market, et cetera. Of course, the U.S. can only achieve its goals of not having ICE vehicles by the mid-2030s. New York just signed into place a new law that would ban all new ICE vehicles by 2034. The U.S. can only do that if it has battery manufacturing capabilities. There's really no other way to do that within a decade, and quite frankly, they can't do it without South Korea's involvement. It's just not a realistic goal from the U.S. And then lastly, similar issue, I know that Dr. Lee also mentioned this, but nuclear cooperation is another big area when it comes to small modular reactors. In the U.S., nuclear really isn't in vogue right now, and I know it hasn't been recently in South Korea and Japan, of course, as well. But there are some, of course, opportunities when it comes to investment outside of South Korea and the United States, particularly when you think about how China is eyeing overseas markets for its own nuclear exports. The same thing is true about Russia. China and Russia, of course, do not have the same concerns about proliferation when it comes to signing deals with, say, for example, Saudi Arabia down the road potentially. So there is a lot of cooperation there that does really kind of merge kind of the hard security and these newer emerging security concerns between South Korea and the United States. And I will stop there, Roger.
All right, thank you, Matthew. I want to thank all of the speakers for delivering quite a bit of complexity in a very concise amount of time. And surprisingly, we largely stayed on time here. Again, there is some space for a few more questions. I do have some questions to go into. I have some for myself, but I'm actually going to jump to some of the ones that are already in the queue first. And these are open to any of the panelists who were part of today's discussion. But one just comes from the timely news from today. Okay, so we saw, of course, we just saw the test of the North Korean cruise missile. Then we saw the North Korean short-range ballistic missile test. We saw the South Korean SLBM test that we have. The question is sort of brings two pieces in here. One, I would ask, are we seeing a arms race of sorts between South Korea and North Korea that's different than the traditional way in which the North Koreans developed and tested weapons that were, again, long-range systems against the US versus what they're doing now, which looks like working on systems designed for use on the Korean Peninsula in theater rather than threatening far distant spaces. And the other piece of that is how should or how is the US likely to react to this change in the or evolution of the security dynamic? And let me go ahead and open that up to our panelists.
I'd be happy to take that because I love these. I don't know. I'm weird. I like it when the missiles get tested because it gives me some new data to look at and some new imagery to check out. But yeah, there's an arms race. It's a pretty fast one. It's a pretty significant one. And I think, Roger, on the South Korean side, the impetus for many of these programs was the 2010 crises, like the Yongpyong-do shelling and the sinking of the Cheonan, where South Korea really wanted to retaliate, but didn't really have the means to do so. And so the thing I worry the most about with this development of these new capabilities by both South Korea and North Korea is that what happens if you repeat a 2010 type crisis with both countries having conventional means of long-range strike, and both, South Korea is kind of substituting conventional counterforce capabilities for the nuclear weapons that the U.S. Really doesn't want it to develop. And so the issue there, though, is if you don't, the issue with counterforces, it doesn't really help to go second. So you have a situation wherein both sides are facing these incentives, should a crisis happen, to go first in order to potentially win the conflict that results. And I think that means, rerunning 2010 or rerunning 2017 as these capabilities improve is going to be much riskier. And so I hope that motivates the US to think more creatively about diplomacy, like I was talking about earlier. But this is going to be very difficult for us to do because as North Korea tests more and more of these systems, they're kind of busting through technical barriers to improvements on the arsenal. And so if you wanted to say, implement an arms control regime wherein we say, okay, you have these liquid fueled missiles, but we won't let you develop solids. Well, they've kind of blown through the solid fuel gap already. So the longer the US kind of waits here, the harder it will be to find those sort of natural technical cutoff points to improve in the arsenal. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of potential risk involved, and I also think that it underlines, if we don't start thinking creatively about diplomatic engagement and maybe willing to be a bit bolder or riskier in our diplomacy, then we're going to end up in a world where North Korea has a very much more diversified arsenal than it does now.
Any thoughts on that, Dr. Sheen?
Yeah, if I may add a couple more points. First, I think there's no illusion. Yes, first, there's an arms race, obviously, between North and South, especially under this Moon government, who was pushing for engagement with North Korea, right? So this is a kind of irony saying that, but this is a reality that this shows that there's no illusion, even under this Moon government, while he is pursuing this engagement with North Korea, but clearly there is understanding about the danger and the challenge of North Korea's increasing WMD capability, that missile and also nuclear capability. Second, going back to Eric's point of this interesting dynamic between conservative versus progressive, there's a kind of irony. Over the past decade, under the 4 different administrations, it was the liberal government or progressive government, both Roh Moo-hyun and Moon Jae-in, they end up with spending much more on their defense buildup than their conservative counterpart, like under Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. And that's happening right now under the Moon Jae-in, and they just, as you pointed out, our defense budget this year was $46 billion, and by 23, South Korea's defense budget will going to pass through the Japanese one. That is quite impressive, and Japanese are quite surprised about. And the reason why is that they want to build up South Korea's counterforce and other capability to meet the challenge of North Korea, so that another long-term issue here is that South Korea eventually wants to have the wartime operational control over coming back to South Korea. To do so, we are required to be able to meet the challenge of those North Korean threat by ourselves. And eventually that also goes along with this South Korean government, a kind of a long-term strategy in dealing with North Korea, because so far, North Korea's refusal to South Korea as a worthy party of discussing peninsula security issue, including nuclear issues, has been that they always tend to say that South Korea is a kind of puppet of American master. So to have North Korea to sit on the table with very serious intention about the peninsula security issues, we got to have our own independent voice in dealing with all those. So there's a kind of quite interesting dynamics going on under this so-called progressive and liberal government when it comes to arms build-up and dealing with North Korea.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I've noticed is that frequently it's under the liberal governments that there's actually an expansion of South Korea's indigenous defense capabilities, much more so than under the conservative governments, which seem to be a little bit more comfortable or confident in the bilateral relationship. A somewhat related question that's come up. Next week, of course, the United States is hosting the leaders of the Quad. There has been a lot of talk about whether or not South Korea would or should be involved in the Quad, or only deal in some of these sidelined issues. And what are your thoughts on should South Korea join the Quad? What are the risks or benefits of that? Is it likely to pursue joining the Quad as a making it the Quint or whatever it's going to expand to if the UK joins? And finally, how does South Korea balance that security relationship with the United States and the region, and its relationship with China, and the ability of China, as we've seen many times in the past, to utilize economic tools to punish those who are perceived as going against Chinese interests? You want to take a first shot at that, Dr. Sheen?
Is it me? Okay. That's a very interesting question, but in fact, that has been a quite a controversial issue in South Korea, I guess, in these days. Everyone knows Quad that goes into the issue of how to deal with China, how we set up our relations with China. Then obviously, first thing is that the Korean position towards China is a bit different from, say, that of Japan. So in that regard, Korea would not want to be in the Quad if that Quad means, so literally it is mainly about China, or it is about containing China, or especially the measures on discussion that comes out of the Quad meeting becomes more concrete about China's threat and how to contain those China issues. Then it will be very difficult for South Korea to officially or publicly say support or joining the Quad. Having said that, at the same time, like the case in recent days, there has been kind of very cautious, I guess, movement by the Korean government under this moon. At least we don't want to be on the kind of same Quad boat when it comes to directly against China or about China. But other than that, if that is about more of a general regional peace and stability issue, rule of law, universal kind of idea, value, etc., free and open, in the Pacific. In those sense, I think South Korea's position has been cautiously kind of approaching to that of aligning with the United States or other Quad members' idea. So that's just the kind of my observation in recent days.
Any of the other panelists have thoughts on that?
Yeah, Roger, I have a point of observation, I guess, which would be that really the blowback concern, I think, is something that China is aware of. And when we look at China over the last year, it's really been building up a lot of its legal architecture to, for example, go after South Korean or US firms, et cetera, that are viewed as being implementing what it views as unrealistic, unlawful US sanctions or US export controls, things like that. And what I think a lot of that is geared at is really incentivizing, or I guess disincentivizing South Korea and other kind of countries that are really caught between the US and China on both the economic and security relationship, as basically is putting a line in the sand saying, if you do go too close to the US, these are the risks and the consequences of doing that. Of course, China, if you look at, and of course, what they've been doing, Australia has a long history of this kind of economic, warfare, if you want to call it that. But they're now putting into place, clear legal mechanisms that can, that are really just, not so subtle messages to countries like South Korea.
Also, I would like to add a couple of points. I think as Professor Shin Sung-ho indicated, we don't have to equate joining or not joining part to the containing or targeting China. So we have to find a very constructive way of integrate the South Korea's regional policy and joining or not joining the part, because that kind of policy, constructive policy design is necessary. So one way of dealing with it is that whether or not South Korea should seek the cooperation on the basis of universal values and principles. That's the way, that's the issues or points where we can start from. And also, we don't have to be obsessed with the formally joining or not joining part. So we can still nonetheless seek the cooperation within the framework of NATO, because NATO is a kind of informal as well as flexible institution. So I think we better take advantage of NATO's main primary nature as an flexible and informal organization. So in that regard, I would like to point out that Korea needs to selectively cooperate within the broad framework of Quad, where it can contribute more. For example, the vaccine production and distribution would be one of the natural candidates for cooperation for South Korea seek within the framework of Quad. So we can still seek cooperation on a very selective basis, and ultimately we can contribute to develop Quad into the more formal and official institution.
Okay.
I'll quadify the panel's response, being the fourth voice. I think one of the big problems with the Quad right now is that it feels like the diplomatic equivalent of throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. It's not clear to me, and I think part of this is the problem is the United States is approaching China through this great power competition lens that is not, it's just like a term and not really a strategy. So anything and everything can fit under it, and the goals are unknown and shifting, and it's hard to judge whether or not it's successful or not. What I think South Korea ought to get a little more involved with the Quad, partially to help bring some, to help see if it could bring some sense of purpose to it, or to help maybe clarify these sort of non-military things that I mentioned earlier. Because I think the Quad, it's not a military alliance, but I think it's sort of like becoming very de facto about, or at least perceived as being primarily about like security issues. But I think that there's much more potential there. And part of it is the US figuring out what the heck we mean by great power competition. But the other part of it is that, getting these regional countries and getting their perspectives of what can we do to help things along for a lot of countries that aren't just the military. Like, how can we expand that? And so that's where I think if South Korea got involved, it could have a very positive role. But I agree that there are pretty high barriers to like turning that involvement into a reality.
We have a couple more questions. I know we're getting close to the end of time, so I want to throw out the first one, and that is building off of this question of the Quad. and considering things like some of the tensions in US, South Korea, Japan intelligence sharing, some of the issues that have been going on in Five Eyes and questionable aspects of intelligence sharing there, is there any potential, looking more ambitiously beyond the Quad, is there potential for South Korea to join something like an expanded Five Eyes in the region, and focus on that intelligence sharing aspect rather than just the perceived floating boats through the region to show that you're tough on China type of aspect that we see in the Quad?
Yeah, probably. I admit I'm less up to speed on the intelligence stuff. But yeah, I think that could make sense, right? Like this idea of integrating countries in the region more generally and getting them to talk to one another, I think is well and good, and you know, ought to be encouraged. So I think they could do that. I guess the question is like, what would they focus on that Five Eyes doesn't already do? And I think that, you know, on the Korean, it's primarily Korean Peninsula and nuclear proliferation monitoring. But you know, there might already be a mechanism for that in the U.S. Relationship. So I think that's kind of the problem here, is like, well, what South Korea could fill the niche. I think it has the capacity to, but like how and what does that look like is somewhat up in the air.
Well, if I may, I think first of all, when those issues was reported in Korean media saying that you know, there was a American Congress promoting that kind of idea from their legislation, first response from South Korea in general, as far as I'm concerned, was a kind of quite positive one. We are nicely surprised that, oh, by the way, United States, you know, trust us enough that they are willing to include us in that very exclusive group. So there was a kind of general, I think, impression or response from Korean media or public. And in that also, yes, there was Japan wanted to be on the board, and there were some other candidates. So this was a kind of, this is a little bit, I think, different from the case of Quad, for example. This is a kind of more broad you know, area of cooperation when it comes to intelligence sharing, not necessarily about, you know, China per se, but also it could be, again, about North Korea. It could be also cyber security issues. It could be any other global, you know, intelligence sharing. If that's the case, I think South Korea could seriously, you know, consider joining Five Eyes if there's only, you know, invitation. This is more like regarded as like a South Korea joining this recent G7 meeting back in Britain as a kind of observer status, and you know, we are looking forward to more of a kind of such a kind of gathering and invitation by those you know, advanced countries, including the United States.
Let me throw out one final question that'll take us back out of the traditional security and back into the non-traditional cooperation space. And that is, you know, we discussed earlier the questions of onshoring or reshoring, nearshoring, adjusting supply chains to be able to match at least provide additional resilience. How do countries like the Republic of Korea or even the United States deal with this dual stress in there of that desire for cooperation and, quite frankly, rising economic nationalism that really wants to hold things in entirely close? And that's obviously also tainted by that question of the security economic or security technology nexus.
My view on that point is that actually, as I indicated in my presentation, Korea, broadly speaking, has attempted to approach restructuring of supply chain from the perspective of diversification. Actually, the efforts of diversification has started even before the outbreak of COVID-19. Actually, as you may know, the Korean companies try to diversify the production facilities from China to other Southeast Asian countries. Vietnam is one of the popular destination for the South Korean companies' investment. And in that regard, the cooperation for the reshoring policy with the United States can be considered as another attempt to diversify the Korean supply chains. In that regard, I would say that the Korean government as well as Korean companies do not consider the cooperation with the U.S. government's reshoring policy does not necessarily mean the exit China strategy.
Yeah, and I would just add one point of observation from the U.S. side of things is that, yes, a lot of the U.S. kind of reshoring policy is driven by concerns about economic security from the imports of raw materials or components that might be coming from China or anywhere else. However, really thinking of it through that lens kind of discredits the kind of main driver of this economic nationalism under the U.S., which is really about kind of the hollowing out of the U.S. manufacturing and the political consequences about that here in the United States. When you look at trade as or free trade as a policy initiative here in the U.S., it's been going out of vogue for about 15 years now, really since 2007, 2008. And really the Trump administration really kind of embodied that in many ways, where it was really about, just bringing back jobs here, not really about, trying to diversify supply chains. It was about, well, in some cases, the fact that, you had, South Korean or German car makers here in the US or even in Mexico, even though they're using US components, that was viewed as even a concern in some ways because it didn't bring the same amount of jobs. So I do think that that is a challenge that the US really is having. And I don't think the US political system, given its polarization, is really going to come to an agreement on how to really strive that balance, particularly if we have in 2024 a return to a potentially, a Trump administration or a Trump-light administration.
Well, I know we could take this conversation a lot longer. It's just starting to get interesting, but we are pushing up against time, and so I'd like to thank our participants today. I'd like to thank our co-host of the East Asia Institute. I would like to especially thank the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Houston, and thank the audience for their participation. If you'd like to speak further with RANE, Stratfor, or EAI, please reach out using the contact information on the screen. Thank you to everybody. Have a great rest of your day, or for those on the in Korea, have a good evening.